Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into a historical record that is, honestly, way more dramatic than any TV show. We're talking about a completely chaotic era where a nation's power structure was literally flipped upside down. For an entire century, it wasn't the official rulers sitting on the throne who called the shots, but the guys holding the swords. So let's jump right into this explosive 100-year history. Picture this. It's the year 1170. The King of Goryeo is sitting right there in the middle of his lavish palace. Geographically, sure, he's at the absolute center of the nation, but the reality of who actually held the power? That was a completely different story. And that brings us to the core theme of our explainer today. True power no longer belonged to the king. It belonged to those holding the sword. It wasn't the royal family or the civil officials deciding the fate of the country anymore. It was the military. They were the ones crowning kings, dethroning them, and steering the nation's future. It was a moment where absolute brute force just completely steamrolled everything else, flipping the political landscape on its head. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the military's boiling anger from years of discrimination. Then we'll hit the explosive 1170 military coup. After that, we're looking at the endless, bloody power struggles, followed by the iron-fisted 60-year rule of the Choe family. And finally, we'll see how the Mongol invasion led to the regime's ultimate downfall. Let's get into it. Part 1. The military's anger from discrimination. Let's dig into the roots of this boiling resentment, because a massive shift in history like this definitely doesn't happen overnight. Just to give you an idea of how intense this anger was, we need to look at the massive inequality at court. Early on in Goryeo's history, things were pretty balanced, but over time, the civil officials completely monopolized politics. Meanwhile, the military officials, they were out there literally risking their lives on the battlefield, but at court, they were reduced to mere bodyguards. They faced public insults on a daily basis. There are even records of civil officials slapping generals across the face at banquets and treating them like court jesters. Can you imagine the humiliation? That absurd treatment was the spark that lit the powder keg. Which brings us to part 2. The 1170 military coup. That massive pent-up anger we just talked about, it finally erupts and it changes the world forever. Looking at the records, the sheer speed and brutality of this coup is actually chilling. Led by Zheng Zhongbu, Li Uibang, and Li Go, the military's very first move was to seize the king's own palace guards. And think about that. The moment the king's bodyguards become the rebels, the old power structure is instantly dead. They completely wiped out the civil officials who had tormented them, deposed King Uijang, and installed King Myeongjong as their new puppet. In one fell swoop, the masters of the nation had changed. Moving right into part 3. The endless, bloody power struggle. Because, as we'll see, the military's swift victory was just the beginning of a long cycle of brutal betrayals. This phrase right here is the crucial thematic anchor for this entire era. Power built by the sword falls by the sword. The very swords the military used to seize control were almost immediately turned against their own allies. The victors simply couldn't trust each other, and that paranoia quickly spiraled into a relentless string of assassinations. Let's map out how this dizzying game of musical chairs actually played out. First, Li Go is eliminated, and then Li Ubang is assassinated by Zheng Zhongbu, but then Zheng Zhongbu himself is killed for corruption. Next up is a young general named Gyeong Daesung, who tries to restore order, but he dies young from an illness. Then steps in Li Umina, a man of lower-class origins who takes power through sheer brute force, only to be killed for his own extreme tyranny. It's just constant bloody chaos until finally, in 1196, a man named Cho Chung-hen seizes control and things take a very different turn. But before we get to Cho, there's a fascinating detail we need to highlight: the dobong. This was a private military guard created by that young general, Gyeong Daesung, to protect himself amidst all the chaos. It wasn't the official state army, it was his own personal muscle. The existence of the dobong perfectly illustrates how true power had completely shifted away from the state and straight into the hands of heavily armed private factions. That sets the stage for part 4, the 60-year rule of the Choe family. The fast-paced, bloody free-for-all finally ends, only to be replaced by a long, heavy, and entrenched dictatorship. 1196. This is a date you absolutely want to remember. When Cho Chung-hyen eliminated Li Uimen and took over, it marked the exact turning point where the chaotic internal struggles died down and the iron grip of a single family began. Now, what's really brilliant about their strategy is how they played the long game.
Unlike the previous generals who painted huge targets on their own backs by flaunting their power, Choe Chung-heon played it smart. He never took the throne himself. Instead, he ruled from the shadows, manipulating the kings exactly how he wanted. For 60 years, across 4 generations, from Choe Chung-heon all the way to Choe, they effectively turned Goryeo into their own private estate, using massive private armies like the Dobong and Sambyelgun to enforce their will. The king was just a figurehead.
But nothing lasts forever, right? Part 5. The Mongol invasion and the regime's fall. This was the ultimate external crisis that signaled the beginning of the end. Let's walk through this domino effect. In 1231, the terrifying Mongol invasion begins. To counter the Mongol cavalry, the Choe regime literally packs up and moves the capital to Gonghwa Island. Now, geographically, this water barrier kept the ruling regime perfectly safe. But back on the mainland, the everyday people were left entirely undefended, suffering through decades of unimaginable warfare and exploitation. The public's resentment skyrocketed, and ultimately in the 1260s, the assassination of the last ruler, Choe, by his own subordinates brought the 60-year family dynasty crashing down. We should clarify, though, that the fall of the Choe family didn't mean the military regime vanished overnight. We see a lingering ghost of military rule, with figures like Kim Jun, Im Yan, and Im Yumu briefly stepping in to manipulate the king. But at this point, it was really just the dying twitch of a regime that had already lost its grip. And that brings us to the final collapse in 1270. Exhausted by decades of brutal war, the royal family finally decides enough is enough. They push for peace with the Mongols and actively refuse to be puppets to the military any longer. Backed by this new dynamic, they purged remaining military factions. With the death of Im Yumu, the military's 100-year dance with the sword is officially over. But, ironically, this peace came with a heavy price, the beginning of a new era of interference by the Mongol Yuan dynasty. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a question. Looking at these 100 years of military rule, what do you think? Were they the fierce defenders of Goryeo who bravely led the resistance against foreign invaders? Or were they just the bringers of chaos, tearing the country apart with bloody internal tyranny just to keep their own power? It's a fascinating, heavy question about a regime that lived and died by the sword. Give it some thought. Thanks so much for joining me today.